Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's rate model educational session. My name is Peter Federico, and it's my pleasure to be able to share some information with you here this morning. Welcome to all of you that are here with us in Saskatoon today, and welcome to everyone who is joining us by webinar as well. So what we're going to be talking about here this morning is sharing with you the impacts of the new rate-making model as enhanced as a result of several recommendations that were made by our consulting actuary and accepted by our board. What I will not be showing you this morning is what your 2018 premium rate might be, but rather what I'll be showing you is what your 2017 premium rate would have been had we implemented the new model in 2017. So the enhancements we're going to talk about today, the changes in the rate model, will not come into effect until the 2018 premium rates. But in order to give you some time to digest what the particular changes are and what particular impacts those changes might have on the mining rate codes, we decided to provide these educational sessions to you. So we have about 2 hours allocated to this morning. I'm going to spend about the first hour going through a bit of a presentation, and then we will open it up for any questions that those of you here today or those online have with respect to what we're going to share with you here this morning. There should be ample opportunity for questions. We also appreciate, though, that we are going to share I'm going to try and not make this terribly technical, but there are certain technical aspects to what we're talking about here this morning that may take some time for you to process. And so I'll share with you later in the presentation how you can put forward questions even after the session is done today. So we are being recorded. The audio is being recorded. And so for those of you who know of folks who could not attend today, who had planned to, but due to the weather or other factors are not able to attend, the actual audio of the presentation together with the slide deck will be available on our website. So we have a bit of an agenda for this morning. We're going to do a bit of an overview of what workers' compensation is and why it exists and how it came about. We're going to share with you the purposes or reason that we proceeded with the rate model review, and then share with you again what the 2017 industry impacts would have been had we implemented the model in 2017, and then talk about next steps. So where did workers' compensation come from, or why do you pay workers' compensation premiums? Well, in Canada, prior to 1915, there was no workplace insurance program. There was no workers' compensation system. The only option that injured workers had in the absence of a workplace injury insurance program was to actually sue their employer in the event of an injury. In most cases, those workers were either not able to, did not have the resources to support a particular lawsuit against the employer, or oftentimes simply were not successful in the courts in terms of being able to receive any sort of compensation for their lost benefits. So they became personally responsible for any ongoing medical. Remember, back in the 1900s, there was no universal health care system, and so you actually paid out of pocket any costs associated with providing the medical care that you had, and you had no other alternatives for compensation other than perhaps trying to recoup that from your employer. In the event that workers in the rare occasion were successful in suing the employer, it often meant the demise of that particular employer, and they often declared bankruptcy, went out of business. So in the kind of 1910, 1915 era, the Ontario government in particular noticed an additional draw on their social security systems because injured workers not having any other means to replace their earnings were going to the social security systems to get some sort of compensation and get the medical care that they needed in order to recover from their injuries. This was putting added strain on that social security system, and so the government of Ontario in 1913 asked a man by the name of William Meredith, today known as Sir William Meredith, to undertake a review of the current system and propose some options to what existed at the time. And in 1915, introduced legislation into Ontario that created a workers' compensation system that today is known as being based on something called the Historic Compromise. And the Historic Compromise relates to a deal that was struck between employers and workers. Workers agreed that they would give up their right to sue, in exchange for which employers agreed that they would fund a compensation system that would provide medical and wage loss benefits to those workers in the event of a workplace injury. Meredith's concept was based on 5 principles, which I'll share with you quickly here. And those principles, I need to tell you, really form the foundational piece of workers' compensation systems in Canada today. And the fundamental principles are also present in other compensation systems around the world. So the 5 principles that Meredith talked about, the first being that this has to be a no-fault system. Workers should not have to prove any sort of negligence on the part of the employer or anything else in order to collect compensation as a result of a workplace injury. The second principle that Meredith talked about was collective liability. Collective liability simply meant that the system ought to be funded collectively by employers who share the liability and risk of the entire system. And thirdly, that the system had to ensure security of benefits. There had to be sufficient funds in that system never to bring into jeopardy the system's ability to actually make the compensation payments that were laid out within that compensation system. And so if you look at the legislation in Saskatchewan, the Workers' Compensation Act requires that the Workers' Compensation Board be 100% fully funded at all times, which means we must have enough money on hand all the time in order to pay all current and future costs associated with the workplace injury. Fourthly, I should say, Meredith came up with this concept called independent administration. And what Meredith was concerned about is that political influences would come into play into the system and perhaps influence the level of premium rates or the entitlement to benefits. And so he said in order to remove the influences that government may have on the system needed to be administered by an independent body. Lastly, Meredith said, that system needs to have exclusive jurisdiction, meaning there is only but one place that you would go to buy workers' compensation insurance, and that's the Workers' Compensation Board. And secondly, that board, that agency, would have exclusive jurisdiction to determine all matters under the Act. So as a result of the work that Meredith did and the introduction of legislation in Ontario in 1915, this quickly spread across the country. And in 1930, Saskatchewan introduced its first piece of legislation, forming its first workers' compensation system based on those 5 Meredith principles, which, as I said earlier, continue to be the foundation or anchor for all compensation systems in Canada. Every province and territory in Canada has its own compensation board or commission, which administers the workers' compensation systems within those jurisdictions. So what is the process by which we establish premium rates? There are 3 steps involved in the establishment of premium rates for particular employers in Saskatchewan. The first has to do with industry classification. So in Saskatchewan, we have approximately 47,000 employers that are registered with the Workers' Compensation Board. Those 47,000 employers are grouped consistent with the collective liability concept that Meredith envisioned. They are grouped into what we call rate codes, or you might think of them as risk pools, based on their primary business activity. So we've taken those 47,000 employers, put them into 50 individual, what we call industry rate codes. based on the primary business activity of those businesses. And those businesses together share in the collective liability of the overall system, and at the rate code level, each of those 50 classifications or industry rate codes, premium rates are based on the collective experience of all employers in that particular rate code. So as we go through the mining codes, you'll see that, soft rock, underground mining, all employers whose primary business activity is that would be grouped into a particular rate code, and their premium rates would be based on the collective liability, the collective costs and claims experience of all employers engaged in that primary business activity. The next step is to actually determine the premium rate. So under the current model, what we do is we would actually look at the past spending patterns, past experience of employers in each of those 50 rate codes, and use that past experience to predict what the future experience might be for that particular group of employers. Now, this might sound familiar to you because this concept of sharing collectively in the liability is really fundamental to all insurance programs. So if you think about your house insurance, you would be grouped with other homeowners who have similar homes, similar risks within their homes, similar locations to where your particular home or what your particular home situation is. So depending on the size of your home, whether you have fireplaces, smoke detectors, whether you're in a floodplain or a tornado zone, you would be grouped with the other homeowners in those particular risk pools, and based on the costs, claim costs within those particular risk pools, you would pay a premium for your house insurance so that if you had to replace your home or had damage to your home from a flood or something, you don't actually pay the full replacement cost. You've paid your insurance premium, and that covers you for all of those particular hazards. So within the industry rate setting process itself, we look at the experience in each of those 50 rate codes independently, and based on the experience within those classes, we determine the amount of premium we have to collect today in order to pay all future costs of claims that would occur in that particular premium year. So we have set and announced the 2017 premium rates. We announced an average premium rate of $1.24. Now that $1.24 represents the collective experience of all 50 rate codes. What we often, and you'll hear me refer to this several times throughout the presentation this morning, what we refer to as board level or board level experience. So when you hear me say board level or board level experience, I'm talking about the collective experience of all 50 rate codes. So that $1.24 average premium rate for 2017 is based on what we anticipate to be the claims activity in 2017. And hopefully is sufficient premium to pay for all of the costs of all of the injuries that will occur in 2017. So we're not talking about funding previous claims. We're talking about collecting enough money today in order to pay the future costs of all claims that will occur in this particular premium year. Once we go through that process at the industry level, every employer in those 50 rate codes will pay that same base premium rate. So at the end of step 2, every employer in the underground soft rock mining rate code would start by paying that same base premium rate. And the enhancements I'm going to talk to you about this morning relate to that step 2, relate to how we actually determine the industry-based premium rate. Now there is a third step involved in actually setting the individual employer final premium rate. And that's something we refer to as experience rating. So again, referring back to your own personal insurance plan and auto insurance in particular. Again, you would be in a risk pool with with auto owners similar to the type of owner you have and perhaps your age demographic and so on and so forth. But if you have a good driving record at the end of the year, you will get a discount from whatever your insurance cost for that automobile are. If you have bad claims experience with SGI, you would see an increase. You'd have demerit points attached to your insurance, and you would potentially see a surcharge applied to your kind of standard premium rate. Our experience rating program is the same way. It's intended to recognize individual employer experience that's different than the experience of all employers within that industry rate code. So again, picking on underground soft rock mining, every employer would start by paying this premium rate. But if an individual employer in that rate code has experience different than most of the employers in that particular rate code, they're either going to get a discount or they're going to get a surcharge off of their base premium rate. In our compensation system, we have two programs within our experience rating. One is called the Standard Program, and it's designed for small employers who have paid us less than $21,000 in premium over the most recently 3 completed years. That program is frequency-based, so it's based on the number of claims that an employer would have. And depending on the number of claims that you have or don't have, you would be entitled to a discount up to 25% or a surcharge of up to 75%. The second program is called the Advanced Program, and this is designed for larger employers who've paid us at least $21,000 in premium cumulatively over the last 3 years. This program is cost-based, so it's not based on the number of injuries, but it's based on the cost of those injuries. And if the cost of the individual employer experience within the advanced program is worse than the average of the industry, you'd be subject to a surcharge of up to 200%. If your experience is better than the average of your industry experience, you'd be entitled to a discount of up to 30%. What we're talking about here in terms of the enhancements has no impact on the experience rating program. It only impacts that step 2, as indicated on this rate process slide, and where we're establishing the base industry premium rate. The experience rating will be applied after that, just like it has been to this point in time. Why did we undertake this review? So this review was really one of the outcomes of what we call a review of our entire financial system. So as I shared with you, we're required to collect enough premium today to pay for all the costs of the injuries that will occur in 2017. But we don't spend all of that money in 2017. Some of these claims, depending on the age of the worker, could last up to 50 years. And so the costs that we would be paying would be distributed over that 50-year period. But we collect all of that premium today so that employers of today pay for the costs of today's injuries, and those costs are not passed on to another generation of employers. Well, what do we do with that excess premium? Well, we invest all of those premiums into an investment portfolio. We currently have about $1.8 billion under management within our investment portfolio. See, I've got a little competition behind me here. But those premiums are invested, managed by independent investment managers external to the WCB. And that investment portfolio is expected to earn a particular rate of return necessary to pay for the future costs of the claims as they come in. We undertook a review of where we were allocating those investment funds, which particular asset classes we should be investing our funds in order to maximize the returns and minimize the volatility in the returns. So we were prepared to sacrifice extraordinarily high investment returns in order to gain more stability in the long-term return. Because we're looking for returns that have to kind of be with us for like the next 50 years, something that can fund us, continue to fund those premiums we collect today, to continue to make the payments on claims well into the future. So we undertook this review. We made some adjustments in terms of amounts that we would have invested in Canadian versus US versus global equities, bonds, real estate, mortgages, the various asset classes that are available to us. Once that review was concluded, we hired an actuary named Eckler to come in and conduct something called an asset liability study. And the asset liability study essentially is to determine whether how we're investing the funds in terms of the assets match the liabilities that we will have to pay as we look forward. So they go through an exercise of calculating, running through various scenarios to determine whether the inflow of income out of the investments will be sufficient to pay the outflow of cash that's required in the future, and what the chances or probability of the board becoming underfunded might be as a result of that. What they concluded was two things. First, they said, yes, the strategy that you've undertaken in terms of changing the asset mix within your investment policy is very good and will help to preserve positive returns in the future and remove volatility. But they said, secondly, as part of your overall review of the financial system, you should undertake a review of the rate-making model because it's an integral part of your revenue stream. I mean, if we don't have those premiums come in the first place, and if those premiums aren't the premiums that are required, it really won't matter how well we're investing that money because we're going to start short to begin with. So he recommended that we undertake a review of our rate-making model. That was also complemented by feedback we received from employers who believed that the model as it exists today was not responsive enough, reactive enough to most recent claim activity, but was steeped far too much in past experience, not recognizing what currently might be the trends. So as we undertook the review of the rate model, we were really trying to balance these four what are often seen as competing principles. So on the one hand, consistent with what Meredith envisioned and what is fundamental to all insurance programs, this concept of collective liability, we needed to ensure that we were maintaining collective liability in the system. But at the same time, we wanted to ensure that we were creating sufficient accountability at the industry level for their own claims experience. The reason these are competing is because if we try and increase the accountability at the industry level, it actually reduces the collective liability. And conversely, if we attempt to increase the collective liability, we decrease the accountability. We also recognize the importance to industry, to employers, of having some stability in their premium rates, not wanting to see rates extremely volatile and swing dramatically from year to year. So we want to preserve rate stability, but at the same time, consistent with the feedback we were getting from employers, we wanted to ensure that the model was reactive enough to respond in a reasonable way to most recent injury experience. If we increase the reactivity of the model, it actually decreases the stability of premium rates. We can create volatility if we go too far. Conversely, if we make stability too strong, we reduce the reactivity of the model. So in moving forward, we're really trying to balance and preserve these particular principles within a rate model in the most transparent way possible. So what was critical to the review? Well, as I indicated, what we're really trying to do when we set premium rates is predict the costs of future injuries and collect sufficient premium in order to pay for all of those future costs. So predictability of the costs was very, very central to our rate-making process. We had to ensure that we were predicting costs in an accurate enough way that we were collecting sufficient premium to pay for the future costs. Secondly, we needed to ensure that the model, we maintained fairness and equity within the rate setting model. And lastly, we needed to ensure that it was anchored on some fundamental actuarial principles, which meant that we really wanted as much science put into the calculation of the premium rates as possible, which would reduce the need for us to somehow intervene in order to create that accountability and reactivity, but maintain stability and collective liability. So what did Eckler determine when he conducted the rate model review? Essentially what Eckler said is the rate model as it exists today works well in terms of predicting premium rates required to fund future costs of claims at the board level. In other words, that $1.24 that we have announced as our average rate for 2017 is the right amount to collect sufficient premiums to pay for the injuries that would occur in 2017. So when we look at the collective experience of all 50 rate codes in the system, the model works well in terms of collecting the premium necessary to pay for the claim's costs. But Eckler noted that there needed to be some refinements, some enhancements to the model. Because when we looked at what the model was doing at each of the rate code levels, it was not doing as good a job of forecasting the premiums required at each of the 50 rate codes. And so Eckler recommended 7 things to us with respect to enhancements of the rate-making model. And I'm going to spend some time going through each of these individually, with the exception of one which I want to cover off right now. And that's the second one that's called classification. So classification, again, I covered that off. That's how we divide up the 47,000 employers in this province among these 50 rate codes. What Eckler noted is some of those industry rate codes are very, very small. We have, I think it's even might even be one of the mining codes that has less than 20 employers in it. And because of the size of those particular rate codes, because of how small they are, the historical experience that we're using in the current model isn't necessarily a good predictor of the future because the sample size is just too small. So what Eckler suggested is that the board establish a process where we periodically and systematically review the classifications with the thought of perhaps merging some of these smaller industry rate codes. We do not have such a process. We will undertake individual classification reviews when we see an issue pop up or a request from a particular industry group to reconsider their classification, but we do not have a systematic approach to reviewing the classifications. The board has asked us, the administration, to build this process. And of course, included in that process would be the need for some fairly in-depth analysis and of course consultation with employers that would be impacted by anything that we would do on the classification side, any potential mergers of industry rate codes. And so we will, as a result of that, that's going to take some time for us to do that. We will build that process that the board requested. In the meantime, there are no immediate plans to merge any of the industry rate codes. So until such time as we develop this process by which we can review the classifications, we will maintain the 50 rate codes as they are and apply the rate model to each of those individual rate codes. So what are the impacts, what would have been, I should say, the impacts of the enhanced model on the industry premium rates had we implemented this January 1st, 2017. Again, just a reminder before we get into the detail, what we're talking about is simply the difference between the 2017 premium rates as established in the current model and what the premium would have been had we implemented the model in 2017. This is not reflective of your 2018 premium rates. It's only to give you an idea of the order of magnitude of the impacts of these enhancements to the model had we implemented this on January 1st, 2017. The 2018 premium rates will be established during the coming year as we collect sufficient data to help us forecast what 2018 injury experience might look like. And those will be announced in the fall, as we have done in the past. And of course, those will be updated for 2018 injury experience. So right now, we only have data available to actually calculate the 2017 premium rates. So the first recommendation that Eckler made had to do with, it's kind of related to the second recommendation around classifications, has to do with something that he calls credibility. And credibility is simply the degree to which you can rely on past performance to predict future performance. Now, under the current model, recognizing that some of these industry rate codes are very, very small, what we have been doing is we have been supplementing or adjusting the experience of these 50 rate codes based on their particularly credibility level at that particular point in time for what the collective experience is of all 50 rate codes. As I indicated earlier, we look at historic spending patterns to predict future. And if we don't have sufficient experience in that historic information, then the predictability of future costs is significantly reduced because it's not large enough a sample size. It's not representative enough of what the future experience might in fact be. But under the current model, we look at 5 years of experience, we calculate an average, and we use that average to forecast future spending. But when we recognize that the industry is not very credible, it's too small, we supplement that with what we're seeing at the experience of the overall industry level. So if the industry is showing sharp increases in their claims activity, but we look at the board level activity and the board level activity is not as sharp as the industry, we would mitigate that. We would reduce what we're seeing at the industry level for what we're seeing at the overall board level. Now, Eckler said the practice of using calculating historical averages to predict the future is a good one, and you should continue to maintain that. But you should not supplement or mitigate the experience at the industry level by smoothing that with the overall level at the board. Where an industry is not large enough, where it's not credible enough to rely on 5 years of historical experience, you should extend that to 10 years. So you have a larger sample that's more indicative of what the experience of that industry might be moving forward. So Eckler recommended that where 5 years of cost history isn't sufficient enough, we actually blend that with 10 years of experience. Now, what do I mean by blending? So under the existing model, we would determine the credibility of a particular industry by looking at how much payroll is flowing through that particular industry. Eckler said that's not a very good or reliable measure because of the volatility of payroll. What Eckler suggested is we should actually look at claims costs. And the credibility threshold established by the Eckler review said that an industry would need $16.5 million of claims costs flowing through their experience over the last 5 years in order for them to be considered credible, for them to be considered, their historic experience considered to be reliable enough to predict the future. If the costs flowing through are less than $16.5 million over the last 5 years, then you would extend the view to 10 years. So by way of example, $10 million in claims costs flowing through an industry is roughly 60% credibility. So if an industry were 60% credible, what we would do is we would use 60% of their 5-year experience, and we would blend that with 40% of their 10-year experience to get a more reliable blend, a more reliable forecast of what the future actual spending might be. So by moving away from smoothing the industry experience by applying the board level experience, and now going to simply the experience of the industry sectors, will have particular impacts on the various rate codes. So if the experience of a particular rate code is worse than the board average, meaning we would have smoothed the industry experience by the board average, by removing that and now have the industry stand more on its own experience by using either a 5 or a 5-10-year blended average, it's likely to see the premium rate go up. If their industry experience was better than the board average, so the board average actually would have been pulling it up, you're likely to see it actually go down. So as we look at the mining codes, what are the impacts? So D71 is open pit mining. So as a result of this change in credibility, now I should say as a preface here, as we go through this presentation, you're going to see the various 6 elements down at the bottom here: credibility, change of indicators, costly claims pooling, fatalities, long-term claims administration costs. We're going to go through each one of these elements separately, and you will see a buildup as we move along. So, don't get too excited or don't start cheering too loudly because you see one particular bar doing one thing or another. We really need to wait until we see the impact of all of the elements together before we get a good indication of what the overall impact might be. So on open pit mining, as a result of us removing that smoothing and holding them more accountable for their own experience, you would actually see a 33-cent increase in the premium rate for D71 had we implemented this January 1st, 2017. So their experience, first of all, was actually worse than the overall board experience. So the board experience was actually pulling their experience down and keeping their rate low. On the other hand, by expanding into the 10-year costs and not just using the 5-year costs, that 10-year experience was actually lower than the 5 years. So that had the effect of actually drawing the premium rate down. So the combined effect of those two things, however, would have resulted in a 33-cent increase in D71's premium rate. D72, which is underground soft rock mining, similarly would see an increase, but much smaller, just a penny. So their board experience, or their overall industry experience, was very, very similar to the overall board experience. So there wasn't a big impact of smoothing based on what we were seeing at the board level. However, their 10-year costs, they're only credible to the extent of 74%, which means 74% of their experience would be based on 5 years and 26% on 10 years. Their 10-year experience was actually higher than their 5 years, and that had the effect of drawing their premium rate, or would have had the effect of drawing their premium rate up by a penny. D73, a little bit different story. So here's underground hard rock mining. So their experience was actually better than the overall board experience. So by removing the board experience from that would have actually had the impact of reducing their premium rate. However, they are 60% credible, so 60% of their experience would be based on 5 years, 40% on 10 years, and that blended. Because their 10-year experience is worse than their 5-year experience, would have actually had the effect of drawing their rate up. The net effect, however, would have been a decrease in their 2017 premium rate of 13 cents. M31, which is, if you look at our classification book, is actually manufacturing and pipeline operations, but included within that code is potash solution mining. And so that's why I'm I'm showing you the M31 code. So M31, the experience of M31 was actually better than the overall board experience, and so that would have had the effect, removing that would have the effect of lowering their premium rate, and their 5-year costs are actually lower than their 10-year costs. They're only 40% credible, which means 60% would be 5 years, 40% would be on the 10-year average. That had the effect of drawing down their premium rate for a total decrease of 9 cents. And again, what I'm showing you here is what would have happened had we implemented this effective January 1st, 2017. The next element that Eckler had a recommendation on is something called the use of indicators to predict costs. So under the current model, the model sought to forecast the number of time loss claims and the costs associated with those time loss claims in predicting what the future costs were going to be and accordingly what the actual premium needed to be. Now, in so doing, what we've noticed in recent years in particular is there's no longer a correlation between what time loss claims are doing and what's actually happening with claims costs. As you probably all know, if you follow any of kind of our workers' compensation information, we have seen fairly dramatic decreases in time loss claims over the last several years. However, what we're seeing on the injury claims cost side is actually an increase in the costs. So while claims are dropping, costs are increasing. So to the extent that we rely on claims costs, on time loss claims, to forecast future costs, we're going to be underestimating the costs, if you will, because we're using those claim costs which no longer are correlated to how we're actually spending the money. Now, we recognize that divergence of trends between time loss counts and costs in recent years, and so we applied something called rate blending in order to try and mitigate that. And what I mean by rate blending is we would run the model and it would determine what your 2017 premium rate should be. But because we didn't feel that that was very reliable, what we were doing is we would go back and take the 2016 premium rate and we would average the two to come up with what the 2017 rate was. So there are two things going on here. One, no longer a direct relationship or correlation between claim counts and claims costs, and secondly, to mitigate that, this blending that we were doing. What Eckler said was two things. Number one, you should not be blending anymore because blending actually reduces the accountability of the industry. But he acknowledged the lack of relationship or correlation between time loss counts and costs. And therefore, he said, you should not be relying on time loss claims to predict future costs. Instead, you should look at the change in the workforce. And what he meant by that is change in the workforce is simply the change in the number of workers insured in that particular rate code. The percentage of workers insured in that rate code. So if the workforce was growing, then what the model should assume, according to Eckler, was that the costs would also grow. And when we mapped the change in workforce against the change in claims costs over the last several years, there was almost a direct correlation between the change in the workforce and the change in costs. Quite different from what we saw in terms of diverging trends in time loss counts and claims costs. So the board has agreed that we will no longer be relying on time loss counts to determine claims costs. Rather, what we'll be doing is we'll be calculating the 5 or 10-year average, as I just explained to you under the credibility recommendation, and we'll adjust it, index it, if you will, for the change in the workforce. So if we see a workforce growing by 5%, we will apply that 5% growth in the workforce to this 5 or 10-year average as calculated under the credibility factor. So as we look at the impacts on the particular industry codes, again, two things going to come into play here. If the time loss counts in your particular sector were dropping, what we would have assumed is your claims costs would be dropping accordingly. When we remove that, it'll bring your claims costs back up and you will see your premium rate increase. Unless there's a corresponding decrease in the change of workforce. So by adopting workforce and abandoning the time loss counts could have a positive or negative impact. Secondly, by removing the blending, by removing the averaging of this year's premium rate with last year's premium rate, will have a positive or negative effect depending on whether the industry benefited or not from that particular blending or averaging. So when we look at the individual industry codes, D71, again being open pit mining, would actually see a net rate decrease of 47 cents. So the adoption of the workforce, so in recent years, there was an increase in time loss counts, and then a decrease in 2015. So what the model was assuming when it looked at increasing time loss counts is that the claims would grow, claims costs would grow at the same rate. But when we apply the workforce adjustment or change in the workforce to it, the workforce was not increasing as rapidly as what we were seeing time loss counts. And so that had the effect of actually reducing the premium rate by 51 cents. However, this particular industry code actually benefited from that blending, from that rate code, or I'm sorry, premium rate averaging, and would have seen their premium rate increase by 4 cents as a result of the removal of the blending. The net impact on D71 would have been a decrease of 47 cents in their 2017 premium rate. D72, similar story. This is underground soft rock. As a result of applying workforce as opposed to time loss counts, their premium rate would go down by 3 cents. And by no longer blending their premium rate, would also see a 2 cent decrease for a net decrease of 5 cents. D73, which is underground hard rock, opposite. We have seen sharp decreases in the number of time loss claims in the hard rock mining. And so what the current model is doing is it's assuming that the costs would drop at the same rate. However, when we look at what's happening with the change in the workforce, you are not actually seeing that particular decline in the workforce. And so when we remove the effects of relying on time loss counts and replace that with change in workforce, has the effect of actually increasing the premium rate by 32 cents. However, by removing that averaging of the premium rates, that blending, would have seen their rate go down by 13 cents for a net increase of 19 cents. And lastly, M31, which really is the solution mining, is what we're focusing on here today, would have seen an increase as well. As a result of adopting the change in the workforce, their premium would go up by 11 cents. However, the removal of the blending would actually reduce their rate by 6 cents for a net increase of 5 cents. The next element that Eckler looked at was something called claims cost pooling. So claims cost pooling is directly related to this concept of collective liability. And collective liability, yes, says that employers together should share collectively in the liability of all claims in the system. But it also dictates that employers should not be unduly burdened by extremely, unusually expensive claims. And so the concept of claims cost pooling is really quite common in most insurance programs. Under the current system, the only claims cost pooling or claims cost capping, it might be a simpler way to think about it, actually occurs with respect to our long-term earnings replacement claims, what we often refer to as pension costs. So if someone's on long-term earning replacement, has some permanent loss of earning power, moving into the future, and is going to receive compensation for many, many years, perhaps until the age of 65, we would actually set them up on something called a pension or a long-term earning replacement, a monthly payment that they would receive. Under the current model, if the cost of a pension claim, of an earnings replacement claim, hits $90,000, we cap the cost of that claim. And we take the difference between the actual pension cost and the $90,000, and we spread that difference among all of the rate codes at the class level. What the class level means is, as it relates to the mining sector, everybody that starts with a D is considered to be a class. So there are 7 rate codes within the D class, including oil and gas rate codes, which we're not going to talk about today. We talked to those folks last week. If a pension claim exceeded $90,000 in costs, we would take the excess of that claim cost and we would spread it among these 7 D rate codes based on their payroll. So if you had a pension claim, its costs were $150,000, that rate code would assume the first $90,000, the extra $60,000 would be distributed on the basis of payroll across the 7 rate codes within the D class. Eckler said this concept of claims pooling is good and fundamental to the rate model. However, your cap amount, is a fixed amount that's been in place for a number of years. No indexing provisions to it. And secondly, it only applies to earnings replacement claims. So what he recommended were 2 things. One, the claims cap amount ought to be tied to something that provides for indexing. And what he recommended is we tie this to the maximum insurable earnings. A multiple of that. So as the maximum wage rate goes up, so would the claims cost cap, because of course claims costs are going to move as the cap on the maximum insurable changes. And secondly, he said, that cap should be applied to all claims, not just earnings replacement claims. So after some analysis and review, we've established and the board has approved that the claims cost cap will be set at 3 times the maximum insurable earnings, which is roughly $252,000. And the difference between, and that would be applied to all claims, not just earnings replacement claims. That cap would apply to all claims, and any cost in excess of $252,000 would be spread across all 50 rate codes, not just the D class, on the basis of their proportionate share of claims costs, not payroll. So in my example, that same pension claim cost $160,000. No longer are we going to grant that employer that rate code relief for the costs in excess of $90,000. The whole $150,000 associated with that claim is now going to become the responsibility of the rate code. However, if we had another claim, let's say it's an earnings replacement claim, whose costs are $400,000, the industry code will be responsible for the first $252,000, and the difference, the $148,000, would now be spread among all 50 rate codes on the basis of their claim experience. The impact of this is twofold. So if you were an industry code that had high pension costs above the $90,000, you would have benefited from having those capped at $90,000 and spread out across the D code. However, if you're one of those D rate codes that didn't have any pension costs, you would actually have been picking up a proportionate share of the excess over $90,000. So by increasing that cap to $252,000, the industry that had the claim for $160,000 now is going to see a negative impact. They'll see their premium rate go up because they're going to be more responsible for a larger portion of those earnings replacement costs. However, the other rate code that was picking up a portion of the $60,000 excess will not pick up anything because they're below the $252,000, and they would see their premium rate go down. So depending upon the activity in that particular rate code as it relates to pension costs and the degree to which you benefited or not from the pension pooling based on your own pension activity would determine whether this particular change is going to have a positive or negative, or would have had a positive or negative impact had we implemented this January 1st. So we look at D71, which again is open pit. Small decrease of 1%. The pension pooling, this was one of the codes that was actually subsidizing somebody else in the D class. Their rate was actually being increased as a result of the pension pooling cost. By removing that, that actually reduces their premium rate. That was offset to a certain extent by there was still some very expensive claims cost pooling going on, because remember, the claims cost pooling now applies to all claims, so it might not be just an earnings replacement or a pension claim, but they're now going to pick up a share of the overall pool in excess of $252,000. The net effect of that on D71 would have been a 1 cent decrease in their premium rate. When we look at D72, underground mining, the impact of less than a penny, really no impact as a result of this particular change. When we look at D73, which is hard rock, very, very minimal change, a slight decrease of a penny as a result of moving to this particular recommendation. M31, a larger impact, so this is again the solution mining folks. The pension pooling used to actually increase their premium rate. Removing that actually would have decreased their premium rate to the extent of about 5 cents. So you'll see as we move along, certain elements, changes to these elements would have positive and negative impacts, would have had positive and negative impacts on the premium rate for 2017. The next piece that we looked at were how we actually treat fatality costs. Under the current model, we calculate a 10-year average of all fatalities across all 50 rate codes. And every rate code pays exactly the same proportion of those fatality costs. So included in the 2017 premium rate is a 4 cent charge that every rate code pays whether you actually had a fatality or not. What Eckler said is that is really, really diminishing the accountability of the rate codes. And you should stop doing that. Rather, you should hold the industries that actually had the fatalities accountable for their own fatality costs. When we looked at that recommendation, we took that recommendation to the board asked us a really good question. And the question was, why would we treat fatalities any different than any other injury? there really is no reason to treat them any differently. And so the recommendation was we will no longer, two, pieces to this, we will no longer charge every rate code with a share of the 10-year average of all fatality costs. We will actually hold the industry accountable for their own fatalities, but treat those like any other claim, meaning they will be subject to the same claims cost capping, the $252,000, as any other fatality. And the difference between the actual cost of a fatality and the $252,000, again, would be distributed among the 50 rate codes based on their particular claims experience. So, as it relates to fatalities, we would calculate the 5 or 10-year average of those fatality costs, and we would charge the rate code with that particular amount, subject to the claims cap of $252,000 per claim. Now, some claims, depending on circumstances of the individual who passed away, would be quite different. So if you have a single individual, no dependents, there might only be burial costs associated with that. So the cost of that fatality will only be $10,000. However, an individual with dependent spouse and 3 dependent children could see costs as high as $1.6 million. And so consistent with that collective liability concept, not wanting to overburden employers for the cost of excessive claims costs, we would cap that $1.6 million at $252,000 and take the difference and allocate that across all 50 industry codes. So the impact on the industries will come from really 2 things. Did you have any fatalities over the last 5 years, being the experience period? And if the average of those fatalities was greater than the 4 cents that is currently being charged in the model, you would see your premium rates go up. If you had fatalities, but they were not as costly as the fatalities that went into that 10-year average, so the costs are less than 4 cents, you would actually see your premium rate go down. Now, depending on the credibility of the industry, remember we're using either 5 years of average or a 10-year average. So if you've had fatalities in the 10-year period but not the 5-year period, you could still see a net impact on your premium rate depending on the cost of those fatalities. So when we look at the individual industry rate codes, we look at D71, again, open pit mining. They had 0 fatalities in the last 5 years. So they would see removal of the 4 cents that was charged under the current model and see a net decrease of 4 cents in their premium rate. When we look at underground soft rock, we'd actually see a 1 cent increase. There were 4 fatalities over the last 5 years between 2011 and 2015. And the blended 5-year, 10-year average of those fatalities was greater by a penny than the 4 cents that they are currently being charged. D73, they had 0 fatalities. They had no fatalities over the last 5 years, but they had fatalities within the last 10 years. And so they don't benefit from the entire 4 cents being removed, but they do see a 2 cent or would see a 2 cent decrease in their premium rate. And solution mining, again, they had only 2 fatalities in the 5-year period. They must have had, those are either very expensive fatalities. Either way, the cost was somewhat less than the overall cost of the 4 cents, and so they would have seen a net decrease in their premium rate of a penny. Next element is something called long-term claims. So again, under the current model, we use 5-year average to determine what the future costs might be. Included in that 5-year average are all claims regardless of the year of injury. So for 2017 premium rates, we were looking at the most 5 fully completed years, which would be 2011 to 2015. when we look at the 2011 costs, we would have costs for claims that occurred in 2011, but we'd also have claims costs on injuries that occurred 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we bring all of those costs, regardless of the year of injury, into the calculation of that 5-year average. What Eckler said when Eckler had a review of this was that doesn't create very much reactivity in the model. It actually has the effect of mitigating the reactivity, because what you're assuming is that the experience over the 50 years is somehow going to be repeated 50 years from now, which is not necessarily true. Industries totally change, practices change, and so those old claims costs are not necessarily representative of what the future claims costs might be. So what he recommended was that we limit the number of years that we take into each of the years included in the 5-year average. After some analysis, what we determined was using a 7-year cutoff would capture roughly 75% of the costs of the industry. So for 2011, claims activity, which would have gone into the 5-year average, we would only use the most recent 7 years. So we'd only go back as far as 2005. We would ignore the costs associated with any injury that occurred more than 7 years ago. For 2012, we'd only go back to 06, 2007, to 07, et cetera, et cetera. So we're only taking the most recent 7 years into account in calculating the 5 or 10-year average. So we were talking about a non-credible rate code where we're using the 10-year experience. We would apply that same thing to the 10-year-old costs as we would to the 5 or the 1-year-old costs. Now, there still will be costs incurred in those other 43 years. And somehow we have to fund those, or we will not collect sufficient premium in order to pay for all future costs. What the model will do is it'll take the costs associated with injury claims more than 7 years old, it will pool those costs and distribute those proportionally based on claims costs across all 50 industry rate codes. So if the largest proportion of an industry's claims are in the first 7 years, by removing the averaging of 43 years, you're likely going to drive up your premium rate because you're using the most expensive part of the claim experience in the determination of your average. If the preponderance of your injury costs are mostly in that 43-year period, you're going to benefit from this because pooling will be applied to those old expensive claims costs. And you'll get relief from that, and accordingly, you would see your premium rate go down. So what do we see when we look at the individual industry codes? Well, I'm behind in my slides here, wasn't I? D71, again, the open pit, would actually see their premium rate go up by 2 cents. So they have a greater proportion of costs in the first 7 years than they do in the previous 43 years. D72 underground soft would actually see a decrease of 2 cents, larger proportion of costs in the 43 years than in the 7 years, so they actually benefit from the pooling. D73 being hard rock, 0 impact. Roughly the same experience under the new model as there is under the current model. And solution mining, M31, would actually see a 2 cent increase, again, not benefiting from the averaging of the 43 years. The preponderance of claims costs would be in the first 7 years, not in the last 43 years. Last element that Eckler looked at was the allocation of administration costs. The Workers' Compensation Board is not any different than any other business in that the costs that we incur on the administrative side fall into two buckets. One being fixed costs, which are not necessarily dependent or not dependent upon the level of core business activity, and you have variable costs that are very dependent upon core business activity. So from a workers' compensation perspective, our fixed costs, really in a nutshell, are anything associated with any activity other than claims activity. So all the administrative costs are IT, our human resources support, the board, the executive expenses, the registration processes for employers, clearance processes, all of those things would be considered in the fixed category. The variable category are those costs directly associated with the adjudication or management of claims. So any claim activity, any costs associated with any claim activity would be considered variable. Under the current model, we assume that 10% of our costs are fixed and 90% are variable. And we allocate the fixed costs to industries on the basis of their payroll. The variable costs are allocated on the basis of claims costs. When Eckler looked at it, he said this is very good practice, but when he looked at other jurisdictions, so when he did a bit of an interjurisdictional comparison, he noticed that we were kind of out of whack with what the other percentages were for other compensation boards in Canada. And so he suggested that we actually have a look at what the actual percentages were. And when we did the analysis and divided up our costs in those two buckets that I mentioned, well, we determined that 30% fixed and 70% variable is a more accurate representation of exactly where our costs are than the 90-10 split. And so the recommendation and enhancement approved by the board was to shift from a 90-10 split variable fixed to a 70-30% split variable fixed. Generally what this means to rate codes is if you have high payroll relative to low claims costs, you're going to be seeing a premium increase because you're going to be picking up a larger portion of the fixed costs, as Eckler put it, paying your fair share of the fixed costs associated with the entity. If your payroll is low relative to your overall claims costs, you may actually benefit from this because the variable component is dropping, even though the fixed component is increasing. If your payroll is relatively low, you may not be picking up as big a proportion of the fixed costs. So really dependent upon the industry rate codes. Impact. We look at D71, open pit mining, would have actually seen a 12-cent decrease in their premium rate had we implemented this. And that's attributed to two things. Would have actually seen their variable cost component go down by 18 cents, but they would have seen their fixed cost component go up by 6 cents for a net decrease of 12 cents. D72, underground soft rock, would have seen a 2-cent increase, 4-cent decrease in the variable component, but a similar 6-cent increase in the fixed component for a net increase of 2 cents. D73, which is underground hard rock, a 7-cent increase, really no change in the variable component, but an increase of roughly 7 cents as it relates to the fixed element. And M31 being solution mining, similarly a 6-cent increase, no change in the variable component, basically stayed the same, but a 6-cent increase as a result of picking up a greater proportion of the fixed costs. So as we look at these charts, and I mentioned to you earlier, this is really a slow build-up of what the impact of these various enhancements would have been had we implemented this model in 2017. So what's the cumulative effect? When we look at each of the individual rate codes and we add up all of the puts and takes, what's the net effect? When we look at open pit mining, D71, we actually would have seen a 28-cent decrease in the 2017 premium rate. Now, what does that mean in real terms? It means this rate code, D71, would have paid us $271,700 less in 2017 than it will under the current model. This is one of those very small rate codes. There are only 17 employers in this rate code, which means the average per employer would be roughly $14,220. So had we implemented this in 2017, employers on average in D71 would have paid us $14,000 more in premiums than what they're going to pay. Of course, this is going to be very dependent on the size of the employer. I'm only sharing with you the overall averages. D72, underground soft rock, would have seen a 3-cent decrease. This would have amounted to a reduction of $156,845 in 2017 premiums. There are 49 employers in this rate code, so the average decrease would have been $3,200. D73, hard rock underground, would have seen their rate go up by 9 cents. What that means is D73 together in total would have paid us an extra $243,000 roughly in 2017 premium than what they're going to. There are 66 employers in this rate code, which means the average increase per employer would have been about $3,680. Solution mining would have gone down by a penny. Total impact is only $23,800 roughly. There are 56 employers in this rate code, so the average decrease would have been $425 per employer. So what are our next steps? So as I mentioned earlier, today's audio presentation is being recorded and will be, if it hasn't already, will be posted on our website, which is www.wcbsask.com. We're going to open it up for questions in just a minute here, both for those of you present here in the room as well as any who have joined us online could submit questions. However, in the event, I appreciate that we've shared a lot of information with you today, and you may need to have some soak time with this information. So as questions occur to you after today, please submit those to, we have an email address set up, askwcb@wcbsask.com. Please funnel all of those questions through that particular email, and we will respond to you as quickly as possible. Now, one of the things we're interested in hearing from employers about is what are some of the options relative to implementing the new model, transitioning, from old to new. And again, I know that, we're only giving you a potential impact here because we don't know what the 2018 experience might look like, so we're only sharing with you proxies of what that might be. But some of the impacts on some of the industries can be fairly significant, and the board is interested in hearing from employers of what a reasonable transition plan might be. So by way of example, D71 would have gone down by roughly $241,700. That could be applied entirely in 2018, or it could be spread out over, let's say, a couple of years. So we would apply half of it in 18 and half of it in 19, or some other options that you might have. Now, why would a rate code like D71 be interested in phasing this in at all? Because they at least appear from our analysis here to benefit from this. Well, because if we look at D73 would have gone up, would have paid us an additional $243,000 in premium. D73 might be very interested in a transition, spreading this out over a couple of years. Because we still have to collect the same amount of overall premium, if we offered a transition to D73 and mitigated the impact of this potential increase, in order to keep our revenue whole, we would also have to apply that same transition to D71 and only provide half of the forecasted decrease in 18 and the other half in 19. So if you go on, please provide any of your feedback with respect to how we might transition this through this particular website only. So no need for mass emails or mass faxes. Provide any feedback and ideas you have through www.wcbsask.com/feedback. That particular feedback site will be open until April 7th, so you have until April 7th to provide your input. And when you go to that particular place on our site, you'll see that we've given you a couple of options, ones that I've shared with you today. Do it all at once, just put it all in, and let's go full bore in 2018, or spread it out over 2 years. But you'll see below that a box that says other. What other thoughts or ideas might you have with respect to how we transition this? So following receipt of all the feedback, again, which would end on April 7th, we will analyze all the feedback received, provide that to the board, and the board will have to come up with a decision with respect to how we would proceed with implementing the enhancements to the rate-making model, either through transition or all at once. I really do appreciate all of you joining us here today in person and through webinar. And I cannot pass up the opportunity to simply remind everyone of how important it is for us to actually continue to focus on eliminating injuries in this province. As they say, the least expensive injury is the one that never ever happens, and for sure is the easiest to manage. We have seen tremendous progress as a result of efforts of employers and workers in Saskatchewan over years in pursuit of our Mission Zero, which is zero injuries, zero fatalities, zero suffering. And I'm very, very pleased to share that when we look at our 2016 statistics, 88% of workplaces in Saskatchewan went injury-free. They achieved Mission Zero. That is absolutely terrific, is an improvement over 2015, but we still have a ways to go in our pursuit of Mission Zero. So I thank you for your past support and commitment to improving the health and safety of workplaces and communities in this province, and ask for your continuing support and commitment in doing that moving forward. Thank you all for very much for being here today, and I would open it up for questions. We do have just a little less than an hour available, but time is it? Yeah. But there are microphones on the floor for those of you that are here today. We would ask that you use the microphones to share any questions that you have, so our participants online can also benefit from that. And because this is being audio recorded, future viewers can also understand the various things that you may have asked about. So please, any questions? Thanks, Brad.
First Great presentation that brought everything into a little more clarity for me. I was just wondering, when you talked about the merging of the 50 rate classes, and you don't have any plans to do that yet, do you have a mechanism that you're looking at to do that in a potential time frame?
So we're going to build that. We don't have a mechanism right now, Brad, but we are going to build that. I would say we would hope to have some sort of process built perhaps by the end of the year. But that would just be the way that we would go about doing that. As I said before, there's a fair amount of analysis that we have to do. So if we were considering merging, let's say, some of the mining codes, someone's going to be positively and negatively impacted by having new partners. And so we would want to understand what those impacts would be and for sure consult with the employers impacted before we proceed with that. And I think that's going to be a several-year process in getting through all of the rate codes that may need consideration in terms of potential merging.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Anything online, Victoria? Kaylin? Nothing online? Any other questions? Well, seeing none, again, I'd like to thank everyone who chose to join us, was able to join us here this morning, both in person and online. Please be safe out there. It's quite a blustery day. The streets are not in that great a shape. So be careful when you're driving and walking out there, and stay safe, and thanks for coming again. Take care.